He was the bad guy, but man, did everyone want to be him. That charismatic villain who just oozed machismo and completely changed the game. With a toothpick in his mouth and gold chains on his neck, he wasn't just cool, he was the definition of cool. But that swagger, that confidence, that whole iconic persona, it was a mask. A carefully built character designed to hide a man haunted by a dark secret. A secret that would define his life, pour gasoline on his demons, and ultimately play a huge part in his tragic downfall. This is the story of Scott Hall's darkest chapter, the one they don't tell you about in the highlight reels. The story of how his most dangerous opponent was never in the ring, but inside his own head. Before he was Razor Ramon, way before the NWO, and long before millions were chanting his name, Scott Hall was a 24-year-old bartender in Orlando, Florida. And on the night of January 15, 1983, his life was permanently altered. Hall was working at a strip club called the Dollhouse when a man named Rodney Perry Turner confronted him. An argument, reportedly over a woman, exploded into violence in the parking lot. Turner didn't just argue. He smashed the windows of Hall's car before coming at him directly. The fight turned physical, and in the struggle, Turner went for a handgun. In a split-second, life-or-death moment, Hall wrestled the gun away from him, and in the chaos, it went off. Rodney Perry Turner was shot and killed at point-blank range. Hall was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The charges were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence and Hall's claim of self-defense, but the event left a scar that would never heal. He later admitted in an ESPN interview that the memory was burnt in my brain. He confessed, "I did probably the most unhealthy thing I could have done. I didn't seek counseling. I was a kid." The guilt and the untreated PTSD from that single traumatic night became a ghost that followed him everywhere. It was the catalyst for a lifetime spent trying to outrun the darkness, as Hall turned to alcohol and drugs not for the party, but for the escape. It was a decision that would nearly cost him everything. A year after that fateful night, Scott Hall stepped into the world of professional wrestling. He spent the next decade grinding, building a career, but it wasn't until 1992 that he truly became a superstar. He joined the World Wrestling Federation and, taking a little inspiration from Al Pacino's Tony Montana in Scarface, he created Razor Ramon. He was the bad guy from Miami, dripping with a charisma that just pulled you in, and fans were hooked. His in-ring psychology was praised as nothing short of genius. He made the Intercontinental Championship feel like the most important title on the planet, becoming the first ever four-time champion in WWE history. His ladder match against Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 10 is still legendary, a benchmark for innovation that's considered one of the greatest matches of all time. Razor Ramon was the villain you weren't supposed to like, but everyone did. He was cool, arrogant, and seemed completely untouchable. But the persona was a shield. The more successful Razor became, the more Scott Hall struggled. Behind the scenes, his dependence on alcohol and drugs was spiraling. He was a key member of the infamous backstage clique with Kevin Nash, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and Sean Waltman, a group known as much for their backstage power as their hard-partying ways. While he was hitting career highs, his personal demons were dragging him down, building a reputation for being unreliable that would later cost him the world championships many felt he deserved. In 1996, Scott Hall made a move that would, once again, change wrestling forever. Feeling underpaid and wanting a lighter schedule, he took a huge, guaranteed contract from the competition, World Championship Wrestling, WCW. On made line between story and reality, making fans think the WWF was staging a hostile takeover of WCW. 2 weeks later in history, that man was revealed to be Hulk Hogan. Together, they formed the New World Order, or NWO. The NWO wasn't just a wrestling angle, it was a cultural phenomenon. They were cool, rebellious, and anti-establishment, and they made WCW the hottest show in town, leading to an 83-week ratings victory over the WWF. Hall was right at the center of the biggest story in wrestling, more famous and making more money than he ever dreamed. But the loose, party-all-the-time atmosphere in WCW was like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. The same environment that gave him creative freedom also enabled his worst habits, and the darkness he'd been fighting for over a decade began to swallow him whole. Before we get into Scott Hall's public spiral and his incredible road to redemption, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel is all about bringing you the deep, untold stories from wrestling history, and your support is what allows us to keep digging. In WCW, Scott Hall's personal issues went from being a backstage problem to a public spectacle. In a move that's still debated today, the company decided to turn his real-life alcoholism into a storyline. Week after week, viewers would watch Hall appear on screen visibly intoxicated, slurring his words, and carrying a drink to the ring. It was car crash TV, blurring the line between entertainment and outright exploitation. His addiction was no longer a secret, it was his gimmick. Behind the curtain, things were even worse. His unreliability became legendary. He'd no-show events, his work in the ring got sloppy, and his relationships with his peers grew strained. While the NWO was a massive success, Hall's own contributions started to shrink as his demons took complete control. He was a 7-time tag team champion in WCW, but the world title, the peak of the mountain, stayed out of his reach. Why? Because nobody could trust him to carry the company. In a 2011 interview, he admitted, "I should have been dead 100 times." It was a chilling confession of just how close to the edge he was living. WCW gave him the biggest stage of his career, but it also created the perfect storm where his self-destruction could spin out of control, until the consequences were simply unavoidable. After WCW was bought by the WWF in 2001, Hall came back in 2002 for an NWO revival. It led to a big-time WrestleMania match with Stone Cold Steve Austin, but his return didn't last long. The final nail in the coffin was the infamous plane ride from hell in May 2002. On a chartered flight back from a European tour, with an open bar and a long delay, all hell broke loose. According to a lawsuit filed by flight attendants, a heavily intoxicated Hall made inappropriate sexual comments and was harassing them before he eventually passed out. The incident was a huge scandal, and it got Hall and Kurt Hennig fired from the company. This kicked off a decade-long freefall into his darkest place yet. He bounced between smaller promotions and TNA wrestling, but every run was cut short by arrests, relapses, and public meltdowns. In 2011, a heartbreaking video from an independent show went viral, showing Hall so intoxicated he could barely stand, needing to be propped up by a promoter. His health completely fell apart. He had a pacemaker put in, battled double pneumonia, and suffered from seizures. By 2013, he was confined to a wheelchair, a shell of the superstar he once was, seemingly just waiting for an end that felt both tragic and inevitable. Just when it seemed like all hope was gone, a lifeline appeared. Diamond Dallas Page, a fellow wrestler and a friend from their WCW days, reached out. Page had already turned his own life around with his DDP yoga program and had famously helped save another wrestling legend, Jake the Snake Roberts, from the brink. Hearing that Hall was in a bad way and talking about giving up, DDP invited him to move into his home, which he called the accountability crib. Hall accepted. The road back was brutal. Years of substance abuse had wrecked his body, and the psychological wounds from his past ran even deeper. But with DDP's 24/7 support and the structure of the program, a flicker of the old Scott Hall started to come back. The journey was captured in the documentary The Resurrection of Jake the Snake, and fans watched as Hall slowly began to reclaim his life. In 2013, DDP helped raise funds for Hall's much-needed hip replacement surgery. But this was about more than just physical healing. It was about finally learning to face the trauma he had buried for 30 years. In an emotional interview, Hall later said, "I'm so thankful for Dallas for reintroducing me to myself." DDP didn't just save his friend's life, he gave him a chance to write one last redemptive chapter. Thanks to DDP's help, Scott Hall got a second act that nobody saw coming. In 2014, sober and healthy, he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame as Razor Ramon. Standing on that stage, he looked like a superstar again. He gave a powerful, heartfelt speech that ended with a line that summed up his entire life. "Hard work pays off. Dreams come true. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do." He was inducted a second time in 2020 as a member of the NWO. In his final years, Hall seemed to find some peace. He reconnected with his family and with the wrestling world that, despite everything, had never stopped loving him. Tragically, in March 2022, Hall fell and broke his hip. Complications from the surgery led to 3 heart attacks, and on March 14, 2022, Scott Hall was taken off life support and passed away at the age of 63. His legacy is a complicated one. He was a revolutionary performer, an innovator whose undeniable cool changed the industry and inspired a whole generation of wrestlers. He was also a deeply flawed man, a cautionary tale about the devastating price of untreated trauma and addiction. His darkest chapter, the shooting in 1983, was the secret engine driving so much of his pain. But in the end, he faced his demons. He kicked out when everyone thought he was down for the 3 count. Scott Hall proved that even after the darkest chapters, redemption is possible. He showed us that even when bad times feel like they'll last forever, a bad guy can, and did, endure.